Thanks for joining SME's Build and Revitalize podcast series on the recent boom in the warehousing and logistics market. I'm your host, Ali Fry. Over the next few episodes, we will talk to business and community leaders about the trends in consumer shopping and how they've created a huge demand for distribution centers. We'll learn about ways communities, developers, contractors, and financial institutions are working together to quickly adapt to the boom and help owners creating facilities in the warehousing and logistics market. In our previous episode, we talked with Kenyatta Hairston Bridges about the positive change that warehousing and logistics facilities are bringing to the local community in Detroit. That left us wondering how these large distributors choose the right community for their next project. Well, Kevin Hegg is here today to help us understand just that. Kevin's a vice president of Ashley Capital. It's a real estate development company that specializes in renovating distressed properties into state-of-the-art facilities that not only add value to the market, but also add value to the local community. He has more than 25 years of experience in this industry and previously practiced law in Washington, D.C. Throughout his career, he's been involved with numerous transactions for Fortune 500 companies, including Amazon, Ford, GM, FedEx, Steelcase, and Canadian National Railroad, to name a few. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Hi, Ali. Thank you. Appreciate that very much. We're excited to be with you.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about Ashley Capital and what you do there?
Yeah, so Ashley Capital is a privately held development company. We focused east of the Mississippi. We focus primarily on industrial facilities, and more specifically, distribution light industrial facilities. It was started 35 years ago or more by Paul Rabaka and Rick Morton. They're kind of the American success story in a very positive and good way. They started off on their own, pooled their money, purchased a building in Chicago, which they kept for almost 30 years. And they've had a string of successes since then. And I've been fortunate to tag on with them almost 20 years ago. And again, we focus on industrial. We started off with the value add, which is buying older facilities, rehabbing them, making them more habitable for multi-tenant use, and then going out to the market. Since a lot of those facilities have been purchased and those opportunities are not as prolific these days as they were before, sort of half of our development business is currently on greenfield sites, new construction currently.
So speaking of a lot of change in the world, we've seen a lot of changes in not only the world over, but in warehousing in the last year. How has that impacted that market in your view?
Yeah, the market really has changed with the world. For years, of the main sectors of commercial real estate, those being office, retail, multifamily, and industrial. Industrial is always looked at as kind of the little brother, the stepson, whatever you want to call it. And since the pandemic has hit, it's really been the star child. We took a big hit with the economic downturn, and we went through many years of difficulties. And we were coming out of it and having a great run prior to the pandemic. Pandemic hit and some things happened. It was really kind of everybody took a pause, as did sort of all commercial activity and all actually personal activity, to kind of figure out what was going on here. Then we had an onrush of short-term requirements trying to help and facilitate the PPE distribution. So everybody was looking around for warehouses to stockpile different types of PPE equipment and other short-term, we hope to be short-term needed emergency supplies. Then once that went away, thankfully, and things settled down, a lot of the activity we were already working on did not go away and was still there, and the demand was still there. So we were juggling the demand between, pandemic related previous activity. And then as things started to shift, lifestyle started to shift to adapt to the new sort of post-pandemic start. Companies like Amazon that were already going strong and other e-commerce fulfillment companies took on a bigger role within all of our lives. And as a result, because they don't use brick and mortar retail, as you probably heard, and focus more on distribution centers, our business really took off. So, in Detroit, we're still automotive centric. That's still the case, but it's really helped to diversify our portfolio base, the market in general, and probably across the board, the impact of e-commerce companies, especially Amazon, can't be overstated at this point, and we're still all trying to figure out how long that will go and how big they will be, and other companies will continue to try to compete with them and vie for similar opportunities in the marketplace. So our occupancy rates have dropped significantly. Demand has caused rental rates to go up. Deals have gotten larger, terms have gotten longer, which are great things for landlords like Ashley Capital.
So you say, this demand has gone up over the past year, and I'm sure over the past few years as we see that transition into more e commerce. With so many sites, especially Amazon building multiple sites a year, how do you determine where to build these massive warehouses and where do you find the sites?
There's a lot of things that go into it, obviously, because of this new demand, it's become more and more of something we've had to work harder at because there are more competitors getting into the market trying to take advantage of some of this new demand. But we've always kept our ear to the ground and looked at other locations. As I mentioned, we focused east of the Mississippi. We have a large enough presence with over 25 million square feet currently, closing in on 30 million square feet, that we're fairly well known. So we benefit from having good relationships and a good source of information through the brokerage community nationally. And there are certain markets that we always keep our eyes on that if you are in our business, you know them, and all of the same types of development companies such as ours, whether you're private or public. You continue to look at the obvious ones being Chicago, Columbus, Indianapolis, Nashville, Atlanta, some other East Coast locations. So we're always keeping our eye on those markets. But because we're a little bit smaller and we're privately held, we also look at secondary markets because in some cases, we can go in and compete with the big boys. And by the big boys, I mean the publicly traded REITs, Prologis, Duke, et cetera. They have sources of capital that allow them to be a little bit more competitive. And their purpose for being it's slightly different from ours. At the end of the day, it's building buildings, making them attractive, and drawing in tenants. But we have our own agenda being private, so we can be a little bit more selective, and as a result, we can go to smaller markets. So we'll look at, we recently built and developed a building in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We look at, my office is in Michigan, although we're based in New York City. We have a facility in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we have some near Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So while the competitors aren't necessarily in those markets, we can go to them. We've made enough mistakes over the last 35 years that we know some things not to do. We keep an eye on our markets. It's the cliche about real estate. It's all about location. That's true for industrial and more true for distribution, just by the nature of its business. So we look at large locations that are well located to transportation infrastructure. If we're going into a new market, we look for a market that we feel like we can build up to at least 2 million square feet within a reasonable period of time, because we also like to self-manage all of our properties so that we're very hands-on, and we can't justify having the personnel in any one market unless we can build up to about 2 million square feet. And then we fall back on our own knowledge, go into those markets, spend some time talking to local municipalities, certainly contact the dominant brokers in their area and try to go with more than one and make a drive around. And then we look at just the general market conditions, rates, average terms, average deal size, average lease rates. And if it justifies, it pencils out basically. If it works economically for us and we can find a good site, we're willing to take the risk. There are kind of two types of developers. There's build-to-suit developers, and then there's speculative developers. Build-to-suit, by its name, is obvious. A company comes to the build-to-suit developer, says, here's what I'm looking for. You have a site in your area. Please design and build it as we specified and build it for us. Speculative is just by its definition, we don't have tenants going in. We may get lucky and have a tenant going in, but most of the time when we buy a building or buy a location, we're going on our own knowledge base and we don't have a tenant in tow, which helps us. People see that as very risky. We've gotten comfortable with it, especially in a market like Detroit. If a tenant comes to you, you can't necessarily ask them to wait 16, 18 months for a building to be built. They need it in the next kind of 90 to 180 days. And so you have to have the building up and ready to go. So, like I said, we've made a lot of mistakes over 35 years. Luckily, we've had a lot of successes too, and we've learned from our mistakes.
So, Kevin, you mentioned in the beginning of the interview that right now you're seeing a lot of greenfield sites, but you also mentioned a lot of mature cities such as Detroit and Chicago that have been built out over time and with a lot of industry and manufacturing. What's your experience been with brownfield sites and redevelopment for warehousing?
Well, thankfully, a little plug for SME. As a result of working with companies like SME, we love brownfields. For a lot of companies, those are impediments to coming into a market. They don't want to take on that risk. We've had a lot of experience throughout our whole history, and we've gotten comfortable, and we're able to make risk-based assessments versus superficial assessments that may drive another developer away. Of late, I could rattle off a number of different locations where we've taken heavily impacted sites, whether it's in Sterling Heights, Michigan, Hazel Park, Michigan, a lot of locations across the East Coast. I was involved in a building in Norfolk, Virginia. That was a former GE facility. They literally were burying munitions in the ground years ago after World War One and World War Two, and we were able to get comfortable with it. Being privately owned, we can make quick decisions. Rick and Paul are intimately and heavily involved, and they've seen as much as anybody. And our crew is fairly sophisticated dealing with these sites. And then we rely on experts, like I said, like SME, to get us more comfortable with what we're doing and what we can do and what the true risks are versus what the perceived risks are.
So, you mentioned a project in Hazel Park in Sterling Heights, Michigan. Can you tell me a little bit about that project and maybe some of the challenges you faced and where the project is today?
Yeah, they're both very interesting. Just by coincidence, Ashley Capital's been involved in redeveloping a couple of former thoroughbred racetracks, one in Livonia, Michigan, and then Hazel Park, which was the iconic Hazel Park Raceway. They were shuttering the raceway. Oh, this goes back about 5 years ago. Thoroughbred racing had was no longer as popular. They weren't able to keep it open, and Hazel Park is at that time economically was not did not have a lot of diversity, did not have a solid tax base, did not have a good foundation for industry and a plan going forward. The site is extremely well located at the crossroads, basically of 75 and 696, allows you to go anywhere in the city very quickly. And then at the same time, Sterling Heights, very similar. It was a former softball field. It kind of sat fallow for a long time. Both of them had environmental impacts. More specifically, both were former landfills and had issues with methane. And not only did they have environmental issues, but they had soil issues, which when you have a landfill, the soils aren't as stable. And also because of the methane, we were required to put in methane barriers, which are basically passively barriers that would help passively offset the methane that was coming out of the ground up and through the buildings. And so we took two sites that didn't have any activity. Hazel Park Raceway was formerly some economic activity, would have sat for quite a long period of time without this kind of investment. Both have been extremely successful. Hazel Park, we're finishing the third building. We're going to have over 2 million square feet. The last building's over 900,000 square feet. The first two buildings are fully occupied, with household name companies, Amazon, LG, Coda Logistics, a couple of other logistics companies. The newest tenant in the third building is related to GM. So here you have a community that had been negatively impacted, and they kind of turned it around with our assistance and worked really closely with us and done a great job. And now they have this great economic engine. Sterling Heights already had a foundation. They're one of the main industrial submarkets within Detroit. But again, that location had sat for a long time, unused, kind of broken down softball park. We built a 575,000 square foot building. We were very fortunate that because of all the demand that Amazon came along and they ended up leasing the entire facility. So it's great for the city. It's great for us. And we're just trying to keep up with it.
Yeah, it sounds like the city received the developments very well. Because Ashley Capital does long term maintenance of these properties, what is the community's response to each of the citizens that, hey, maybe they're not thrilled about having a warehouse across the street, but are they responding positively because it's helping them economically? What's the response there?
For the most part, they are. Obviously, you have some perceptions when you hear industrial, and it brings to mind, dirty operations and maybe not very eye pleasing, et cetera. But if you took a look at one of our parks where we took a tour, they're very much set up, designed, and maintained like an office park. Buildings are much more attractive than they used to be. Partly, it's competition. Everybody's trying to vie for the same pool of tenants, and those tenants want to provide a pleasing environment for their employees. As you mentioned, we self manage, and our intent is we're not a merchant developer where we would build something, fill it, and then sell it to an investment company. Our intent, although we sell properties strategically from time to time, our intent is to hold these buildings 40, 50, 60 years. So we put quality materials into them. We spend the money on the landscaping. We put a lot of thought. I can't tell you the level of detail we go into as far as the site planning, the parking lots, the size of the bays, etc. So while there's a perception that may be negative, we pride ourselves on not being a heavy-handed developer, and we go into a market, try to look at it as a partnership with the city. In some cases, we do meet with neighbors. We try to address all of the situations that we think could be negative up front. The communities have become more sophisticated on their end as far as with their planning and zoning requirements, buffering potential problems from neighbors. So by and large, while the initial perception may be negative, we don't have any ongoing chronic issues. And if we do, we address them quickly, work with the tenants and work with the communities to try to look for a solution that helps everybody.
And Kevin, you mentioned that you guys put a lot of thought into the site planning to make it work with the community around it. Can you tell me about maybe an example project that was kind of unique in its site planning?
Liberty Park, the one I just mentioned in Sterling Heights, there's a couple unique things to that one. Not so much the neighbors, but there is a county drain that runs through the property. So there was this isolated piece of land that was, probably, I think it was approximately 8 acres that we quite honestly weren't sure what we were going to do with it. And for us, it's lost opportunity, lost value. We ended up designing and installing a parking lot, which, fortunately it worked for Amazon and it worked for us. We're working with, I can't mention, it's a very large parcel company. We're working on a very large deal down in Van Buren Township right now. In fact, we're very close to signing it. That does have some neighbors along one property line, and the local municipality requirements are that you must be 350 feet back from any residential, regardless if it's one residential, two residential, or 200, 350 feet back from any residential with any kind of trailer staging. So in that case, we did have to really rework our site plan. We had planned to put car parking along the east side of the property. The tenant came to us and wanted to do trailer staging. We were within that 350 feet, so we basically had to redesign and relocate some of their other parking and move the puzzle pieces around. And we'd already finished much of the site plan already in the site work and some of the curbing and paving, but we're going to go ahead. Luckily, the tenant's partnering with us on this, but we're going to rework some of it and move that trailer staging away from, potential retail, even though in that case, there's truly, I believe, two houses and they're probably 325 feet away. So we're talking about a couple of houses and we're only encroaching within 25 feet or so, or maybe it's 50 feet, but it's not a heavy impact. But working with the township, working with our tenant, we want to do what's right, and we've made the adjustments to make it work.
Do you find that your tenants are pretty receptive to making those changes, or have you had a lot of resistance in changing kind of what they're pursuing in a property?
Oh, for the most part, they're pretty receptive. Obviously, they have a need, and most of them are on a clock. We try to accommodate it as much as we can. We try to inform them and educate them why whatever that situation is, may not be a good idea. And I can't think of a situation where we've lost a deal because a tenant was being unreasonable about what they wanted or needed.
As far as your ideal tenants are concerned, what kind of warehousing and what kind of industrial clients do you look for?
Primarily large distribution companies and light industrial companies. We like clean operations. Back to the perception of industrial. We don't do heavy industrial. We don't have stamping companies or forging companies. So for us, it's really companies that are going to take advantage of the amenities of our buildings, which are high clear height, lots of docks, et cetera. So they're going to come in and rack it out. Companies like the automotive companies, first tier suppliers that work with the automotive companies, the e-commerce companies, those are really our perfect tenant.
What advice would you have for communities that are looking to attract these kind of tenants and this kind of development?
Be reasonable. They have a job, obviously, to make sure that they protect the residents and how their community operates, but have an open mind. Don't get too far into the details of some of the planning. Certainly, you have to do, there are communities that we know of, and all developers run into them that are a little bit more stringent, a little bit more specific. That can make it difficult for the most part on the development end. There aren't many developers that are really looking to jam a square peg in a round hole. They're just trying to look for some reasonable flexibility in what they're trying to do. So it's really have an open mind, know the developers you're working with, go out and visit their sites, see what they look like, visit their potential tenants operations, be pro business, be welcoming. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to offer a ton of incentives. Incentives always help. And as I say, incentives help make a good site better, but they don't make a bad site good. But anything you can do to be welcoming, and I think everybody benefits. Your tax base comes up. It's more money to spend on the community. Within reason, you can set up, reasonable, whether it's site plan or building requirements and zoning requirements that protect everybody, and you can have the best of both worlds.
So you mentioned some incentives and maybe not making a bad site good, but might make a good site better. Are there any state or federal funding opportunities that you've seen help with these type of developments?
The most effective economic development incentives that I have seen in my time are brownfield TIFs, which are tax increment financing areas. The brownfield allows us to go in and even out the playing field, because those brownfields require more intensive investment because of the environmental impact. And the point of having a TIF is that the increase in tax funds that are captured by the community are then shared back with the developer to help offset those specific developmental impacts. We can't just use them for anything. We can't just use them to build some kind of water feature on the property or something silly. We have to use them for specific things that relate directly back to the brownfield. And again, without that, the owner of the property wouldn't be able to sell because there isn't that equalizing factor. The developer wouldn't show up because there's no equalizing factor. And the community is really the one that loses out. So we've done a number of them and we love them. They're great. In every case that we worked on, they've been a success for us and been a success for the community. They don't go on forever. It's negotiated how much is shared and for how long based upon what the added amount of investment is required as a result of the environmental impact. So it makes all the sense in the world. And Michigan is at the forefront and has been for quite a while of creating these opportunities, and also in conjunction with the old BEA process, the baseline environmental assessment process, which allows people to buy impacted properties and purchase as an innocent owner, provided they don't make the situation any worse, and do some due care activities to make sure they don't make the situation worse. So there are states that don't do that, and as a result, nobody's willing to step up and take those risks. So Michigan has been at the forefront. It's been great, and for my money, the brownfield TIFs have been one of the best statewide economic incentives that I've seen.
Well, Kevin, we've certainly seen the same, especially in Michigan, starting to spread out more in the Midwest. So we're glad you're taking advantage of that and helping these local communities. As we're kind of wrapping up here, is there anything else you want to add about the warehousing market going forward or what you think we're going to see in the future?
So short term, that's about all I can see at this point. There are some question marks. There are some things happening in the market that are impacting our ability to move forward. Certainly, demand has not gone down; it continues to increase. I don't see much in the way of that letting up. So the existing inventory of properties is very limited. The vacancy rates are very low. So right now would be a great time to be building additional buildings, and we're trying to do our best to provide that. But what we're getting hit with is it's an unusual issue. A lot of people refer to it as the Amazon effect, but it's not only are they driving vacancy rates down by leasing up a lot of the existing facilities, but because of their activities on their own as well and driving demand, construction materials are going through an incredible increase in pricing. I think I just saw a stat that since August of 2020, steel prices have increased 40%. So that can drive up. We had another building on the books to be developed here in the next year or two, and we're debating on whether to put it on hold because steel prices have gone up so high. I mean, it's one thing if you, first of all, you have to get in line and slot for your steel order, but then even if you can get in line for it, that you've got increases of 40, 50%. And the question is whether other tenants can absorb those costs, because obviously those costs get passed along through the cost of the building in the form of rent. And then again, and then there's some cases where I heard an anecdotal story that things as simple as drywall mud is becoming difficult to secure. And it's like you would never have thought drywall mud would be something that would be hard to get a hold of, let alone steel going up by 40 or 50%. So on the horizon, we're sort of looking at it and saying, what does this mean? Can tenants, like I said, absorb the additional costs and thereby justify us moving forward? Rental rates have already increased fairly significantly over the last couple of years just from demand alone, and now you've got the additional impact of added costs. It's something that we as speculative developers have to really look at and see whether it's something we're willing to sort of put ourselves out there at risk at moving forward on a building. We build buildings of 500,000 square feet plus, so it's not an insignificant amount of risk. So we're optimistic. All the fundamentals are good. We'd sure like to continue building some more buildings, and we plan on having some more that we've already started. But seeing out beyond kind of 12 or 18 months, we're cautiously watching what the costs are and if the demand will stay strong.
All really good points, Kevin. It's definitely an interesting time to be a speculative developer.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you again. SME's been extremely helpful for us in trying to wade through some of the murky waters on the environmental side. There's some specific instances that I'm working through right now that I don't want to publicize, but you guys have been instrumental in leading us through and understanding all the ins and outs and the regulations and all the mad science that goes on beyond it. So we really appreciate it, and we hope we can continue doing what we do and that you'll be along with us.
I'm sure we will. And thanks, Kevin, for coming on today.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Build and Revitalize podcast series on the warehousing and logistics market. Tune into our next episode featuring Jason Salazar. He's the Vice President of Estimating with Oliver Hatcher Construction. He has some great insights into the construction challenges and opportunities in this market. Be sure to subscribe to the Build and Revitalize podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Check out www.sme-usa.com to join the conversation, access show notes, and catch up on our series on diversity and inclusion in the AEC industry, the warehousing and logistics market, and many future series. While you're at it, connect with SME USA on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. See you next time.